Hello, welcome. We are so thrilled that so many people are interested in bumblebees. We had about 250 people register for this event from all around Colorado and even other parts of the country. My name is Nancy Bartholomew, and I am an intern with Native Bee Watch. Also here tonight is Lisa Mason, the Arapahoe County Extension agent who actually leads Native Bee Watch. This is a statewide community science program in which volunteers go out a couple times a month during the summer to monitor bees in their yard or in a public space. They categorize those bees into 8 morphospecies categories like bumblebee, green metallic bee, and then they submit data about the bees they observe along with what plants they see them on. If you're interested in learning more about Native Bee Watch or joining as a volunteer next season, please check out nativebeewatch.org, where you can also sign up to be on our mailing list, email list. Tonight, I am so pleased to present Dr. John Mola from Colorado State University. His lab group researches pollinator ecology and conservation, mostly focusing on native bees. Much of John's own research over the years has been on bumblebees specifically. There will be time at the end of John's presentation for questions, but please feel free to type them into the Q&A throughout the evening. Lisa and I will try to answer some of those as we go, and then we'll leave others for John to field at the end. Tonight's webinar will be recorded, and then we will share this out with you. Without further ado, I turn it over to John now. Thank you.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me. And Nancy, could I just get a thumbs up that I have the right screen showing? Cool. Yeah, so I'm super excited to talk with you all. I kind of messaged Nancy this earlier that I got a little overexcited putting this talk together because I give lots of talks on bumblebees and bumblebee research, but often it is I'm talking about a specific research project or talking about some body of work that's just been completed or something like that. So the only real chance I get to talk about bumblebees in that context is, a little bit of background information. So hopefully everybody's on the same page. But tonight we're going to dive in a lot more unabashedly into bumblebee life history and biology. And so because I added far too much information, I also added off-ramps for myself. So we'll get through lots of cool information and then kind of see where that leads us. But I will be cognizant of your time so we can have some fun doing some Q&A at the end as well. So I'm going to talk about bumblebee and bumblebee ecology and conservation with a bit of a focus on the Front Range, but honestly, at first, this could apply to basically bumblebees anywhere in the world. Before I get going, I do want to shout out the lab a little bit. So I started at CSU in October 2022, though I've lived in Fort Collins since January 2020. And again, I'm going to talk about bumblebee life history and kind of broad concepts about bumblebees, not specific research projects. But if you want to learn more about the cool research going on in the lab, you can go to our lab website at molalab.org. And you may notice Nancy here in this photo from when she was doing some fieldwork with us and independent research with us this past summer and fall behind us. And one other plug before we get into the heart of today's discussion. A project that I have going on with Dr. Rebecca Nemec, who's a social scientist in the Warner College, is looking to understand some experiences and perceptions of honeybee keepers and be able to aggregate that information from across Colorado so we can build better extension and outreach materials and do better research on kind of the interface between non-native honeybees and native bees. So if you're a beekeeper or you know of a beekeeper, sign up to participate in an interview. It should be a pretty interesting experience. So I do want to give you some goals for today, so you're on the same page as me for what I'm hoping to accomplish together tonight. One is to understand some core concepts of bumblebee life history and ecology. What does the bumblebee year look like? What kinds of foods do they forage for? What are the stressors and fail points in a colony's journey towards reproductive success? We'll talk very little, but maybe a bit more, depending on what kind of rants we get into, about current issues in bumblebee conservation, and a special focus on a subgenus of bumblebees that's of particular interest. And then this is the one that I'm really wondering if we'll get to, but discussing basic bumblebee morphology and kind of building a foundation for identification. So when Nancy shared the list of participants with me, I saw that it was folks from all over the state. So rather than focus on, a handful of species along the Front Range or something like that, I thought it might be better to build some toolkits for folks to study IDing the species in your area on your own. But this way we can at least make sure that everybody knows what kind of traits are most useful in that identification process. And then I'll also provide you some resources for that further study, including one resource where you can really cheat at bumblebee ID with success most of the time as well. And so, yeah, we can't be comprehensive. Colorado is a big state, lots of different changes in elevation, which means that, the bumblebees that I might see in my backyard in Fort Collins can be quite different than what somebody on the Western Slope would see. But I did, at the end of the talk, kind of after the talk, I added a whole bunch of slides that are available to you online. And just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, all those slides basically will take the format of something like this that I hope will serve as a resource for you. And I won't talk about these slides today, but you'll have access to them online, but detailing how to identify some of the more common bumblebees, which species you might mix them up with. And they use these little icons from Virginia Scott's Bumblebees of Colorado book, but with what I think are a little bit more accessible types of characters for IDing them for beginners. So that's where you can find that information and all of today's slides. All right, but the reason you're here and the thing you want to learn about is not the logistics and background of my talk, but the organisms that we're interested in. And hopefully you're aware from your interest in being here tonight, but also from Lisa's work and Native Bee Watch, that there's over 20,000 species of bee around the world. And they have a huge variety in life history, different ways of storing pollen and nectar on their bodies, different ways of attracting mates. They come in a dizzying variety of colors. And they even have really bizarre life histories, like species that store pollen and nectar wet and don't carry pollen on their bodies. Other species like euglossine orchid bees, shown here in the bottom right, or at least their legs shown here in the bottom right, who collect floral scents and other oils from plants to make perfumes to attract mates. So you could study all sorts of concepts about ecology in the world just from looking at bees alone. And I bring that up because I want to point out that we're going to talk about bumblebees, and that's our focus tonight. And I love and obviously am obsessed with bumblebees. That's what I've dedicated my life to. But when we talk about bumblebees, we're talking about a very small slice of bee diversity, a particularly interesting one perhaps, but we shouldn't view these as broad representatives of bees writ large. But the bumblebees are fuzzy ambassadors to the insect world. I always like to bring up that my wife, who's English, has taken me to the UK. And when I go there, I noticed that the Brits really seem to love bumblebees. There are bumblebee tea towels, bumblebee mailboxes, door knockers shaped like bumblebees, anything that you could put a bumblebee on or make look like a bumblebee, the Brits have it. And I asked her why the British seem to love bumblebees so much. And her response was because we killed all the other wildlife long ago. And so hopefully your reason for loving bumblebees or being interested is not because all the other wildlife are gone, but because you find bumblebees potentially fascinating themselves. There are over 260 species of bumblebees worldwide. Um, and we have a good amount of that diversity in North America, but the highest region of bumblebee biodiversity is in the mountainous regions of Asia, which is probably the geographic origin of bumblebees. So bumblebees most likely evolved somewhere around the Sichuan province of China and then spilled out, colonizing other parts of the global landmass from there. Um, of kind of an interesting note and aside, this map does not show any bumblebee species in New Zealand because New Zealand does not naturally have bumblebees. But bumblebees were introduced to New Zealand by the English for clover pollination. And now there are actually species of bumblebee in New Zealand that are extinct in England. And so bumblebees get moved all around the world in just the same way that we love and appreciate honeybees. Bumblebees have some of that kind of human history to them as well. But the point I want you to really pull here is as their large bodies and fuzzy coats kind of suggest, bumblebee biodiversity is highest in the temperate mountain regions of the world, of which we happen to live in one. So why be interested in bumblebees when there's all this diversity of bees kind of more generally? I could give lots of reasons to answer my own question, but three that I want to focus on and dive into a little bit are the economic and ecological importance of bumblebees, specifically their pollination services for crop and wild plants. Talk a little bit about the size variation and large size of bumblebees generally. So I noticed Lisa has also made use of this figure in some native bee watch material. But you can see some of the bumblebees in here are quite large compared to other bee species generally. But there's also substantial variation in body size within a bumblebee colony or within a bumblebee family. And that's rather interesting from an evolutionary perspective because colonies kind of have some say over how they partition that variation in body size and what that means for success or failure of the colony. Whereas many bee species, the vast majority, most offspring are going to be basically the same size as their siblings, at least. And then lastly, I'll touch a little bit upon some learning and cognitive abilities. So bumblebees get used as model organisms for understanding how invertebrates more broadly might learn. But we have some reason to believe that they're particularly clever within the invertebrate world. And you may have seen images like this string pulling experiment circulating online. When we think about this economic and ecological importance, I think it's particularly interesting in Colorado, a region where summer and spring kind of arrive in these fits and false starts oftentimes. And that's really an environment in which bumblebees seem to be able to handle, in which other bee species really kind of struggle with. And part of that is due to that large body size of bumblebees and their ability to control their own internal temperature to some extent. And so because of that ability to generate their own temperature and insulate against cold and extreme weather conditions, bumblebees are some of the most important pollinators of early season plants, both wild and crop plants. And wild pollination services by bumblebees to crops are valued in the hundreds of millions or billions, though it is hard to estimate those things. And while wild bumblebee pollination services are quite important, you might be interested to learn that there are also commercialized and domesticated bumblebee species. So there are a couple species around the world where we have succeeded at breeding them in captivity. And you can even purchase bumblebees in little boxes like this. And they get commonly used for greenhouse pollination, yeah, as well as field pollination of crops like peppers, tomatoes, and blueberries, things that are very stubbornly pollinated by other organisms. And this pollination service, this pollination industry with bumblebees, especially with tomatoes, is worth tens of millions of dollars a year. So we have this strange desire to eat tomatoes year round, and we are able to do that in part thanks to the pollination services of bumblebees within greenhouses. So we're actually able to keep them in these little boxes, and they very effectively buzz pollinate these tomatoes. While that's well and good, and is strange in its own kind of human industrial sort of way, one unfortunate irony of this bumblebee domestication is that these species also cause substantial conservation and stress issues for native bumblebee species. And I'll touch a little bit on that later. But as you can imagine, disease spillover or competition between these cultivated species and wild species is an issue, much like it is for honeybees as well. Part of the reason that bumblebees are particularly handy for pollinating these types of crops is because a large number of plants have what are known as poricidal anthers, or these tube-shaped anthers. And you can see here, this anther has an opening on the end. And so bees that just try and visit this and try and gather pollen naively can't get access to it. Instead, what has to happen is that the bumblebee or other bee species that are capable of buzz pollination actually bite into the anther and grasp onto the flower, and then they dislodge their flight muscles, and then use those flight muscles rather than to fly. They use that to vibrate their bodies rapidly, and that causes the pollen to eject. While about 40 to 50% of bee species are capable of buzz pollination, many never learn how to do it, or they just seem to not favor doing buzz pollination, and they visit a different kind of flower. But bumblebees quite readily do this to get at these really protein-rich food sources. And so that is why they're of particular importance to crop pollination by tomatoes and these other poricidal plants, because honeybees are not capable of this behavior, or at least they stubbornly refuse to. That body size in bumblebees also kind of suggests something about their flight abilities, and the way in which a bumblebee perceives the world. So this figure that I'm showing you here, you'll notice that the axes are transformed, so they're nonlinear, but we have a clear kind of positive relationship between the x and the y-axis. And what this is showing on the x-axis is basically the body size, so the distance between the wingspan, the wing pads of a bee. And so a positive relationship between the size of the bee and the distance that they can forage under a variety of different measurements. And so basically all this is saying is that bigger bees can fly further. And we, in fact, see that when we manipulate that in the wild. And what that means is that the bumblebee's world and the bumblebee colony's world sort of is a little bit bigger than most bee species. So bumblebees can fly up to 5 to 6 kilometers profitably, meaning that the cost of flight, the cost of flying 5 to 6 kilometers is about the same as how much nectar and therefore energy they can store in their bodies. So bumblebees can fly those 5 to 6 kilometers, but most small solitary bee species are flying maybe only 100 to 200 to 300 meters from their nest at most. Bumblebees can fly that 5 kilometers, but most of their foraging probably occurs within 1 or 2 kilometers. But that's still like a huge distance, right? If you think about looking at a bumblebee in your backyard, its nest could be located quite a long way from where you're observing it. What that means from kind of an ecological perspective or our concern over bee declines might mean that we can view bumblebees potentially as being more resilient to habitat fragmentation. So if lots of floral resources are distributed in patches that are split up over a large area of the landscape, bumblebees may be able to better tolerate that because of their strong flight abilities. On the other hand, they're bigger, so they demand more resources, so that fragmentation may make it more difficult to navigate the world and gather those resources. That's not going to help you ID bumblebees, but should you ever find yourself wanting to do a bumblebee dissertation, great topic of study. The other kind of area that I want to emphasize and give you some insight on is this idea of bumblebees as model organisms for understanding cognitive ecology. So you may have seen images like this, where people have trained Bombus terrestris, or the buff-tailed bumblebee. It's one of these domesticated species, to do all sorts of weird behaviors to get at nectar rewards. And so in this experiment, Lars Chitka and others in that lab trained bumblebees to pull on a string. And if they pull on a string, they get to the center of this disc, this kind of fake flower, and they can drink nectar from that disc. That's pretty cool. But what's kind of even more interesting is that bumblebees that have never done this activity themselves, but have observed their siblings do this activity, know how to do this activity. So you can train a bumblebee to do this activity, but bumblebees can also learn from other bumblebees that they simply just observe doing this activity. And so this sort of suggests that bumblebees have a really strong learning ability. And why would they have that? Well, one of the reasons is likely because they handle lots of different types of flowers. As I'll show you in a minute, the bumblebee season is quite long. They're out on the landscape foraging for several months of the year, and there are successive generations within a colony. So you can't just rely on foraging on a single plant species that might only be in bloom for a few weeks. Instead, a bumblebee colony might initially collect on something like lupins, and then they move to rosaceous plants, and then they move to something like sunflowers at the end of the year. And each of those plant species is going to require different mechanisms to get at the pollen or at the nectar, and different ways of learning how to handle those flowers. And so bumblebees are quite able to handle all sorts of complex types of flowers, and that gives rise to a strong demand for a high cognitive ability. Neat. And you can also exploit that to teach bumblebees how to predict the World Cup final. This is probably the only time that England seems to win an international match, much to my disappointment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about actually, I'm going to talk a lot. So this is one of the things that I decided to expand a little bit. I'm going to talk about the bumblebee life cycle and bumblebee season. And I'll give you first kind of my general impression of bumblebee life history, and then I'm going to show you some cool videos and images of each one of these steps, not just this kind of cartoon schematic. But what I want to point out, at least initially, is that bumblebees emerge early in the spring as solitary individuals. So if you're familiar with how honeybees create new colonies, they kind of split up a big old colony, and the queen, along with an entourage of workers, goes and establishes a new colony. Bumblebees don't do that. Instead, the bumblebee queen emerges early in the spring as a solitary individual, carrying all the sperm and eggs that she'll need to establish a colony within her. She'll establish a colony, and I'll break down these steps in a moment, and produce workers. And then that colony will grow to some size where it produces new males and new queens. At that point, hopefully the new queens and new males mate with individuals from different colonies. And then the new queens are the only ones who overwinter to the following year. The workers, the males, the old queen, none of them live more than that one season. So to break that down a little bit for you, because it's quite cool, and we have some good multimedia for you. I'm going to show you images and videos from a bunch of different species, kind of all stitched together. But this is sort of the prototypical bumblebee life cycle. So this is a Hunt's bumblebee queen that emerged early in April 2020. This video was sent to me by a friend. And you can see this queen, you can tell she's a queen. She's quite large. Her wings are quite smooth. They haven't been beaten and become rough on the edges from flight. But you can also tell that she's probably dipped her face in a bit of pollen already. She has some pollen on her wings, pollen on her face. But early in the year, if you observe queens, you'll see them in kind of this slow, lethargic state as they begin to warm up again and gather energy from early season nectar sources. You can even see her kind of probing at this leaf with her tongue to try and get any sort of salt or sugar. When these queens eventually do find sources of energy, they consume quite a lot. So early in the season, they'll be on plants that are really rich in nectar because they're trying to rebuild their energy from a long overwintering period, but also because they're working to establish their nests. And the way they establish nests is pretty consistent among species. And I'll show this video a few times, but this is a queen nest searching, and you may observe this in the wild. So you can see through this image, there is a queen kind of zigzagging back and forth, low to the ground, and there's no flowers around. So what she's doing is investigating the forest floor here and trying to look for something like an abandoned rodent burrow or a favorable tuft of grass or some sort of hole. And that's where she'll establish her nest. They don't excavate their own burrows. They might pull in vegetation or do a little bit of home building, but they're not digging out cavities underground. Instead, they're looking for pre-existing substrates that are suitable for nesting. And if you see a queen doing this, watch her for as long as you can. This one's moving rather fast, so she's probably not finding anything that seems agreeable. But if you observe a queen doing this zigzagging pattern, you'll see her go into holes and then come out after some amount of time. And so this kind of suggests that these sites are quite hard to find. And so maybe nest sites are quite limiting in a lot of landscapes. But assuming our bumblebee queen, our hero, does successfully find a nest, she'll begin making a little pollen patty and maybe a little nectar pot for her to remain on her brood for as long as possible. So in this schematic, we've basically drawn a mass of pollen and nectar all mixed together, and then the queen lays her eggs in that, which develop into her workers. And she incubates those eggs and that developing larvae just like a chicken would. So the longer she can stay on that mass and generating heat, the better. So this is a really fraught period in the bumblebee life cycle, because you can imagine anytime she has to leave the nest to get more resources, she's really at risk of somebody coming and consuming that. And so that's what this is what that looks like in the laboratory, where we have to work with them under red light. But you can see this yellow-faced bumblebee has sort of extended her abdomen and wrapped it around her brood mass and is pumping heat into it. This is a Hunt's bumblebee queen from this year. And if you kind of squint and look closely, you can see her nectar pot here, and then she's incubating this brood mass underneath her body. After about 6 weeks or so, if things go well, she produces her first cohort of workers. So here we have 2 little workers scrambling around the nest, and they're kind of disturbed from us filming them, but Normally, these workers would also go about nest building and incubating this brood mass. This one's just kind of hanging out in the corner, I guess. Over time, the colony grows, and you can notice that it's quite ramshackle compared to something like a honeybee colony, which has very precise geometry. Instead, we have nectar pots made out of old brood clump over here. There's developing brood here. There's workers kind of up and down and every which way. There's all sorts of frass at the edge of our box. There's ejected larvae. It's kind of a mess, but that's fine. They only need to develop this colony for a few months. It's not like this is some long-term housing. So the colony develops over the season with the workers doing all of the collecting of pollen and nectar. And this is what a very large colony can look like at the end of the year. So there's lots of variability among bumblebee species. Some species, like our local brown-belted bumblebee, might produce only a couple dozen workers at maximum size, and instead they produce fewer larger workers. But a species like Bombus vazasenskyii or the yellow-faced bumblebee produce really large colonies. And so you can see there's just huge numbers of brood here, and it's can reach just shy of about 1,000 workers or so. So quite active. Just to show you a wild example, here is I don't know the common name, Bombus melanopygus colony that I accidentally discovered in 2015 in California. And this colony has been attacked by some sort of mammal. There was sort of a dig pattern all around it. And so you can see that their brood cap has been exposed. You can see kind of this waxy mass of brood here. And they're scrambling to save their colony, basically. But a few things I want you to notice here are, in addition to individuals still incubating the brood, you'll also notice that there's all sorts of leaf matter and thatch in here. This isn't just from grass kind of falling into this hole. Those are actually materials that they gather to insulate their nests. So they have all sorts of kind of architectural innovations, if you will. But unfortunately, sometimes they get found by predators. But if things go well and you don't get eaten by rodents or succumb to overheating or something like that, then hopefully the colonies reach a size where they stop producing any more workers and begin producing males and new queens. And those males are really kind of interesting. So they don't contribute to the colony in any way. They're produced and then they leave. And so males kind of just linger for a really long time at the end of the field season or at the end of the growing season. So right about now, we're just starting to see the first males of many species in Fort Collins, at least. And you'll notice that they kind of just aggregate on thistles quite commonly, or other Joe Pye weed in urban environments. And there can be large groups of these males, and they're often quite spindly looking compared to the workers because their legs are not designed to carry pollen. They have an additional abdominal segment, and they often have these mustaches, which is quite handy for remembering that they're males. And as this photo sort of implies, these males don't sting. They don't have stingers. So if you're confident it's male, you can pick it up, and that's a cool party trick. But they find mates in a variety of ways. So there seems to be 3 common ways of finding mates. One is simply finding nests and waiting for new queens or gynes to emerge from those nests and then tackling them. Another is to set up scent trails by kind of moving back and forth and laying a trail of pheromones that queens are attracted to. And then the third way that I think is particularly fun and interesting is by perching and waiting. And so this is a brown-belted bumblebee male, and you can see that his eyes are quite enlarged. And so they use these large eyes to have a good field of vision. And if you find a brown-belted bumblebee or another bumblebee species with these enlarged eyes kind of perching somewhere, and you throw like a little pebble or something past it, it'll chase it. Basically, they will chase anything that could possibly even be a potential mate. Another kind of interesting species in the area is Bombus fraternus, which also has these enlarged eyes, and they'll hover something like 50 meters above the ground for long durations, waiting for females to pass by. Interestingly, those species are both kind of more grassland associated. I'm not sure if you know that's kind of related to that wide field of view. If things go well for everyone, then hopefully the males find some females and they mate. Females will often kind of push males off of them to probably ensure that they find a good, strong mate. But oftentimes you'll see several males on a single female all at once as she's been kind of tackled to the ground. But often the female will mate only a single time. And either after mating, quickly begin looking for an overwintering place, or even plug up her spermatheca and refuse, basically reject any further sperm. So that's what the mating looks like. You often see them kind of tumbling from the sky. It's quite interesting, and you can see the huge size difference between the male and the queen here. So after that mating leaves us only one thing left to do, and that's actually the majority of the bumblebee's year, and that's overwinter. And surprisingly, we know quite little about bumblebee overwintering because it's hard to observe. But here's an example of a Hunt's bumblebee digging a hibernacula. So after mating, they'll find some sort of loose, friable soil or substrate and dig a little burrow just a few centimeters below the surface. They'll produce a antifreeze-like material within their bodies to help them survive over winter. And that can be 6-8 months in some areas. So that's sort of the bumblebee life cycle, and your tour through it. One really important thing is that they go from this solitary to social and then back to solitary. And so you can imagine all these solitary phases are a little bit more fraught, a little bit more risky times for the bumblebee. This is, of course, entomology, so I'd be remiss not to mention some fascinating exceptions, and that's this subgenus of cuckoo bumblebees in the subgenus Cythrus. And so this is a species that's prevalent around here, Bombus insularis. And you'll notice that her hair is kind of patchy, and these bees have produced much stronger chitin. They don't have pollen-carrying appendages, and they basically are built incredibly tough. And the reason for that is because rather than producing her own workers and having this social life cycle, instead, these queens actually invade the nests of other bumblebee colonies, kill the queen, and then more or less enslave the workers to raise her own queens and males. So they don't produce workers, they just hijack the colonies of other bumblebees, kind of in these vulnerable first, just when they have just a few workers early in the summer. And so here's a video of one of these queens attacking a colony. And you can see that this is the cuckoo bumblebee, the rupestris queen, and she's quite large and burly. She's kind of beating up the workers right now. She's already killed the queen, and soon will begin using basically this pre-existing brood mass to raise her own offspring. And so as you can imagine, these species, because they rely on the presence of other bumblebee species, are of particular conservation concern, because if you don't have many other bumblebees in high abundance, then you certainly can't have these cuckoo bumblebees in high abundance. But they are quite kind of bullyish. Okay, so I'm going to touch a little bit on bumblebee declines and conservation now that you are experts on bumblebee life history. And I think, this is maybe why people are quite into bumblebees. Other than them being fascinating, you've probably heard something akin to, the bumblebee is going extinct or the bumblebee is endangered. And for many species, those are true concerns. So earlier I mentioned to you that bumblebee species diversity is highest in the mountainous regions of Asia. Unfortunately, we don't have good kind of conservation assessments for most of those species. But if we zoom into North America, where we have about 50 species, about a quarter of those species are threatened to some extent. And these are by IUCN categories. And that doesn't mean that everything's copacetic with these other species. There are also declines in their abundance and conservation concerns that are geographically restricted. But for about a quarter of the species, we have significant concern over the trajectory of their populations. To put this in kind of a little bit of a geographic context for you and think about how this is represented by the Endangered Species Act, right now there are 2 bumblebee species officially listed under the Endangered Species Act. There's the rusty patch bumblebee, which used to be common and widespread throughout the northeastern United States, and Franklin's bumblebee, which was always quite rare, but now has not been seen since 2006. There are also several other bumblebee species that are proposed for listing, including a species of significant local interest, Bombus occidentalis, or the western bumblebee. And these species are under threat from a variety of stressors. There are introduced pathogens that have spilled over from commercial bumblebee operations or spread around as we move honeybees or other organisms around. There's also substantial threat from pesticides, which can not only directly kill pollinators, but also cause substantial sublethal effects. So earlier I talked about how bumblebees need to be able to learn lots of different types of flowers to be successful in a given year. But these pesticides, even if they don't kill bumblebees directly, can substantially dampen their cognitive abilities and then make learning those flowers more costly, thus lessening the reward that they can get throughout the season. And when you already have a challenging life, a little bit more challenge can be the difference between success and failure. And then, of course, our other common stressors of habitat loss and degradation and climate change. And you can imagine for species that are adapted to cool, high elevation, mountainous kind of environments predominantly, rising temperatures is quite a stressor on their life history. But one thing that I want to point out to you particularly is this, what I like to call the curious case of Bombus sensu stricto, which is a subgenus of bumblebees, so a group of closely related bumblebees. So here's all the bumblebees that are proposed for listing in the United States. But about half of these species, the ones in red, are within this one subgenus. And then 2 of those species are cuckoo bumblebees, those invader, non-social, antisocial bumblebees that rely on that subgenus. So why is that? These 2 other species are also of conservation concern. They seem to be more associated with loss of habitat quality. Well, first of all of these species are short-tongued, and so that means that they may struggle to access different types of flowers. But also, it's likely that disease spillover from the commercial production of bumblebees plays a substantial role in the declines of these species. So those species that we use to do the string pull experiments and pollinate our greenhouse tomatoes, in the early 90s, we wanted to be able to use more than just this European species. So folks that had already domesticated these European species brought species like Western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, back to Europe to be reared in commercial operations. And the hypothesis is that diseases that those European species were adapted to spilled over to these North American species. And there's some support for this hypothesis, though it's hard to retroactively paint this story completely. But it seems to be our most likely explanation for why we've lost this subgenus in particular. And so I use this as a cautionary tale for, when we think about moving honeybees around or even moving other native bees around, we need to be really thoughtful about, these unintended consequences of moving disease around. Of course, this is not the only stressor. These species also seem to be affected by all sorts of other stressors in the environment. And just to give you a little bit of focus, I want to talk a little bit about Bombus occidentalis, the western bumblebee. So this species, as recently as the mid-90s, was well distributed throughout the western United States. If I had been giving this talk 35 years ago, you'd say, how are we online? But then after you said, how are we online and talking to each other, you would also say, I thought Bombus occidentalis was the most common bumblebee. And you would be right. But in a rapid amount of time, this species has declined substantially. And basically now we struggle to find this species on the West Coast. And we're fortunate here in Colorado that it still remains. So this is the predicted occupancy of this species in 1998. And you can see in 2020, it's been lost from a good chunk of its range, though it still kind of holds on within our region with some regularity. But we don't know exactly why. One of our kind of strongest correlations is that we've lost the species most rapidly in areas that have gotten hotter and drier at a faster rate than the others. And so the strongholds seem to be areas that are forested or other large natural protected areas. And so, because we sort of can document the decline, but we want to be able to come up with solutions, reporting sightings of this bumblebee are particularly important because that allows us to know where on the landscape we can find it, what kind of plants it's using, and hopefully do something to stem its decline further. So in addition to Native Bee Watch, I encourage y'all to consider looking into programs like Bumblebee Atlas. And to help you identify this species, I want you to be aware of this program called Bee Machine, beemachine.ai, or you can download the app Bee Machine. And there's all sorts of AI crap out there now. But this is actually produced by Brian Spiesman at Kansas State University and works quite well for identifying bumblebees. Though I do caution you to approach it with a little bit of skepticism. And what I like is that it provides kind of these ranges of confidence. Here's an example of a Hunt's bumblebee male that it insisted was a different species. But when you get these high confidence levels, Bee Machine does quite well. And if you start getting into bee spotting, then you can use this tool to help you report your sightings. Now, I want to be cognizant of time, so I'm going to move past this section on understanding the morphology of bumblebees for identification. But what I want to point out is that many of us, when we begin identifying bumblebees, we focus on only the color on the abdomen, and that's a good predictor. But there's also substantial variation in the coloration on the thorax, as well as the body size of bumblebees. And quite importantly is this characteristic of head shape. So if you start to begin to want to move past identifying something as a bumblebee or not a bumblebee, but actually identifying it to species, learning how to see and identify this head shape characteristic is quite important in your journey of moving past coloration alone. And you can see it here in an example with kind of this short-faced Bombus rufosinctus, where its head looks quite compressed, versus this more horsey-faced Bombus fervidus, where it has a quite long face, which you can kind of see here. And again, as I said earlier, all these slides, I think, are kind of written in a way where you can work through them yourself. whereas some of that life history stuff I thought was better for us to go through. So you have all of this available, but um, a few things that I want to emphasize is that when seeking to identify bumblebees, they're certainly easier to ID to species than something like mining bees or whatever, but it still takes practice. Don't get discouraged. There is substantial variation among individuals within species. And so take photos, submit them to iNaturalist, where folks can help you identify your bees. But also that information is critically useful. So those maps that I showed you of the Western bumblebee decline, a significant part of that information comes from these observations that people make and upload online. And then that allows us to do the science that allows us to prioritize which species to, or determine which species to prioritize in conservation planning and in our restoration activities. In order to observe bumblebees and take pictures of them, you of course need to be able to find them, and I'm happy to talk more about this. But this is a non-exhaustive list of plants that are particularly good for bumblebees, especially early in the year. What I want to point out here is that there's a lot of mints and legumes on this list. And so if you're thinking of something to plant in your yard or species to go look for to find bumblebees, you do well to prioritize areas that have lots of mints or legumes. Part of that is because they produce lots of protein in their pollen, and bumblebees are kind of like bodybuilders. They really prefer high protein food sources, even more so than other bee species. These are some of the materials that I suggest if you really want to build those identification skills or learn more about bumblebees. These are the things that I suggest you look into. Bumblebee Atlas and Bee Machine I already mentioned, but you can get Bumblebees of Colorado for free by just searching for it online. It's written by Virginia Scott and Abigail Wright, among others. It's pretty good. I will say that it misses some nuance. But it's a great starting point. And in complement with purchasing a copy of Bumblebees in North America, you should be able to begin identifying bumblebees basically anywhere in the state. And again, all the slides and more that break down some of these identification sources in another way are available on the website. And I realize that sounds like an infomercial. It's free. It's just information. And providing all these sorts of observations and stuff, I know it's like a bit cheesy to say that we can save these species, but I really do think we can. There's good examples from butterflies that were under decline and have had substantial recovery. And I want to point out kind of one optimistic example. This is alongside some work we did with Nancy last year, where we actually observed a Western bumblebee male in Denver proper. And that was the first time that species had been seen in Denver in a few decades. And I think it's in no small part to the city of Denver putting in lots of pollinator plantings, but also Denver residents really putting in lots of bumblebee and bee food in their yards. And so I think these species truly can be recovered. And right now is a great year to get into bumblebees and bumblebee spotting and uploading your observations because we seem to be having quite a bit of a banner year. So last year we had quite a wet year, and this year we're seeing Bombus occidentalis in quite high abundance. These are two pictures from right here on campus with occidentalis on false spirea and Japanese spirea. And then this is a occidentalis worker nectar robbing twin berry honeysuckle up in the foothills. And so we've been seeing a ton of occidentalis this year, which is a great sign. And if you get bored with the 24 species of bumblebees in Colorado, I have good news for you. There's now a 25th bumblebee species, Bombus bimaculatus, which is quite common in the east, was first spotted in Fort Collins and in Colorado for the first time this year. So it seems to be a really interesting year for bumblebees. And we know this because of the increased interest in this sort of bee spotting. All right, so I hope to take any questions y'all have. I'm happy to stick around for as long as you want, because after this, I'm going out into the field after it gets dark to weigh bumblebee colonies in the dark so they don't fly into my face. So thank you very much for your time and happy to chat.
Hey John, there's some great questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
Let us know if you need anything.
Yeah, so I see a question. Is there evidence that other bee species are trained/taught to buzz pollinate? If so, how is that done? Yeah, so I struggle with recalling the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I know that I can say with confidence, at least in some bee communities, so say like a subset of southwestern US bees, something like 30 or 40% of the species will buzz pollinate without any sort of training or teaching. They just do that naturally. So buzz pollination is fairly widespread among bees. It's just not something that honeybees do. So if we want to pollinate these porocidal plants that have their pollen tucked away in this way, you can't use honeybees for it, but lots of other wild bee species do this just fine. Chris asks, what is the best way to relocate a bumblebee hive? I know someone who has a nest in their compost pile and would like it moved. Carefully. You can potentially gather the hive. If it's in a compost pile, that seems optimistic. So what I would attempt to do is basically get something like a shoebox or a small wooden box about the size of a shoebox with an exit hole in it. And you can try and at night use red light because bees cannot perceive red light, so they won't fly. They'll just kind of crawl around. You can try and scoop up the brood and all of the bees and place it into a box, doing so at night. I've been contacted recently by a couple people who have these nests under their stairs or something and underground, and I can't really think of a good way to get them and the brood out of there without significant trauma. But for something like a compost pile, hopefully scooping them up at night may work just fine. How many times can a male bumblebee mate? Uh, Presumably as many times as it can find a suitable mate. So if y'all are familiar with honeybee male reproduction, basically they have these penises that explode off of their abdomens after mating. Bumblebees do not have that. So instead, presumably they can mate many times. In reality, it seems like most guys only get to mate a single time and then are unsuccessful. It's quite hard to find a mate, and far more males are produced than suitable mates are available, as far as we know from genetics, at least. Why do bumblebees favor mountainous areas? Yeah, so bumblebee species diversity seems to be highest in these mountainous areas. I suppose this is a little bit of a tautological answer, but because that is the sort of seasonality that they are most adapted to. So mountainous areas have this tendency basically to produce large amounts of resources in a short amount of time. And bumblebees, with that transition from solitary to social back to solitary again, are particularly well adapted to taking advantage of that kind of boom and bust flowering. Whereas something like a honeybee wouldn't do well there because it's quite cold, and to have a perennial colony in an area with substantial amounts of snow can be quite difficult without humans, putting them in a heating shed or something like that. And solitary bees do well in mountainous areas as well. It's just that is where bumblebee diversity and abundance peaks the most. Angela asks, what are some concrete things that gardeners can do to make our gardens more hospitable to native bumblebees? A lot of that is kind of the same attributes that the same activities you can do to make a garden better for bees more generally. And it's great because it essentially amounts to having lazier and messier gardens. So that way, you know, when we have those compost piles, when we have those piles of leaves, that generates potential places for these creatures to overwinter. But also generates that sort of material that they incorporate into their nests. What we probably have a lot more control over, though, are the floral resources that we plant. So for bumblebees, since they have that long flight period, they need food resources basically the whole season. So really focusing on having early season resources and then continual amounts of floral resources throughout the whole year is critically important for sustaining those colonies, because they can only really go a few days to maybe a week without bringing in new resources. They don't store large amounts of food. For bumblebees specifically, though, focusing on those really protein-rich flowers, which are mostly going to be plants in the legume family, seems particularly beneficial. That said, if I go back to that list of flowers, you know, I'm not somebody who in urban environments really strictly sticks with native plants only. So I will point out that these false spirea and Japanese spirea, which are in the rose family, seem to be really beloved by a variety of bumblebees, especially short-tongued species this year. Would they raise some of the eggs / larvae from the dead queen?
That's about the cuckoos.
Yeah. So the Cythrus will actually kill and eat for protein those eggs and larvae. So no, they will stop that from happening. And bumblebees and bees in general, I suppose without getting too deep into the genetics, have mechanisms to stop others in the hive from producing offspring other than the queen. And so eating undesired offspring is quite common in the bee world. But the Cythrus specifically will dismantle those unwanted offspring. When taking photos of bumblebees, are there certain angles that make bees easier to ID? Yeah, kind of like well, this one is blurry here, but this side with a bit of top angle. So if the bee was in the foreground of this photo, this would be a great example where you kind of have a side profile, but you can also see the head, thorax, and abdomen pretty clearly. But most of all, getting multiple angles. Yeah. Mickey, hi Mickey, how you doing? Mickey has helped in the lab before. What are the most reliable methods for distinguishing between queen and worker bumblebees? Are size and time of year the primary factors to consider, or are there other distinguishing characteristics? Size and time of year are the primary factors to consider. I will also say, in addition to size, kind of it's a bit of a gestalt characteristic, but how well built they appear to be. And that's something you learn over time from just staring at lots of bumblebees or visiting a museum and looking at them. And you'll notice not only are the queens bigger than the workers, but they often just look more dense. I don't know quite how to describe it. For some species, though, the queens and workers will also have different colors. So for something like the rusty patch bumblebee, the queens look morphologically quite different from the workers. Joan asks, bumblebee predators? Yeah, so rodents are primary consumers of bumblebee nests. Birds will commonly eat bumblebees while they're foraging, though, you know, you're only losing like a single worker or something like that. And then actually moths and beetles, nest parasites are probably the biggest risk and predators of bumblebees. Mary asks, do bumblebees drink sugar water? Yes, they do. It's both natural nectar as well as artificial sugar sources. We give them artificial sugar sources in the lab. Anonymous attendee, that's a strange name. I am adding native and pollinator plants into my HOA gardens. We've been using Western red cedar mulch. I'm wondering if that is problematic, prohibiting bees from nesting in bare soil. I think as long as the mulch is not uniformly dense and there is some patchiness, then maybe that can be acceptable. What purpose, anonymous attendee number 2 asks, what purpose does a cuckoo bee serve in ecology if it destroys other bumblebee species? Well, those are still bumblebees. And so if there is a way to make a living in the world, some organism will find a way to do so. You know, in a past version of the past 3 million years of the Earth, bumblebees were more abundant, and so perhaps being a predator of or a parasite of an abundant organism was a pretty good way to make a living. I should point out that of the 20,000 or so bee species, some significant number, depending on the community, like 15 to 30% of bees are cuckoo bees in general, or kleptoparasitic bees, I should say. So they are parasites of other bee species. So lots of solitary bees will lay their eggs in the nests of other solitary bees while mom is out foraging. So, maybe they don't have a lot of value to humans if we were to think about it like that. But they certainly suggest a healthy bee community if you have a healthy community of bumblebee parasites. Do weed and feed products hurt bees and other kinds of ground-dwelling bees? Yeah, so there's some research on this suggesting that often the weed and feed products themselves, or the herbicides themselves, don't necessarily harm bumblebees, but the surfactants and other chemicals that are used to help deliver or disperse those products can have significant sublethal effects on bumblebees and other kinds of bees. Additionally, those products are typically used to promote turf grass to the detriment of other plants that produce pollen and nectar that bees would use. So I would encourage people to, use elbow grease to remove weeds and just accept weedier lawns. Again, laziness pays off when you love bees. Would it help to look for the Western bumblebee by searching at the botanical gardens for several hours? My recommendation actually to folks, if you really want to kind of help the most with research, is certainly you can look for a bumblebee at one location for several hours. If you find it, though, it might be good to either continually go back and document different plants that it's using, or go to a new location and try and increase the numbers of locations that we have. But I would say that probably the best way to help with bumblebee conservation in Colorado right now is to get involved with the new Mountain States Bumblebee Atlas. So if you go to bumblebeeatlas.org, because you'll learn how to identify, or rather you'll learn how to capture and take pictures of the bumblebees, good pictures of the bumblebees, so that way they can be ID'd to species. And then the way Bumblebee Atlas works is you'll report both when you do a search and find nothing, as well as when you do a search and what bumblebees you find. And those searches where we find nothing, while they can be a little bit disappointing, that absence data is just as important, if not more important, than that presence data. How fast can they fly? They seem to go slow when looking for food, then jet off. Ooh, I wish I could remember off the top of my head flight speed. Unfortunately, I can't. So I'm just going to say quite fast. But yeah, I will agree that when they're foraging, on flowers, they're kind of moving a bit more slowly in a lumbering kind of manner. And I wish I had included this slide, but so hopefully we all know Albus Dumbledore. So Dumbledore gets his last name, Dumbledore, from the Old English word for bumblebees, which has the root dumble and door, which basically means a low and slow buzzing insect. And I guess Rowling named him after that because she imagined him kind of languidly humming about Hogwarts. Eric says, I've tried dozens of times to create nest sites to attract bumblebees, generally ground level covered cavities with fine dry grass inside and a narrow entry tube. Never seems to work. Any preferred configuration? Getting occupancy of artificial nests for bumblebees without like capturing them and trapping them in a box like we do does seem to have a really low success rate. There's a suggestion that using materials that rodents have urinated on can improve success. So if you have like some rodent bedding or rodent urine, that could potentially increase the success rate, but really low success rate of these. And depending on where you are in the state, what some of Jamie Strange's work seems to suggest that if you're in an area that accumulates a lot of snow, say you're in the mountains or at higher elevation, putting those boxes actually above ground mounted to trees seems to yield higher success. And part of that reason might be because those species are adapted to emerging so early in the year that they're actually looking for above ground cavities because many potential nest locations remain snow covered until later in the season. Joan Nestor Roses asks, would it help to put maybe sugar water out in the early spring? When and what and where to help them get started if plants/flowers are not out yet or are eaten by squirrels, robbing the poor bees of food? I probably would just focus on putting out things that bloom nice and early. And if those bumblebees are emerging before anything's in bloom at a substantial level, that's probably not a gene that we want to encourage. They also do seem to be able to re-enter torpor if they emerge too early and then try again later. Susan, relocation follow-up. If you do scoop up the colony, then what? Yeah, put it in a box and then put that box somewhere that you don't mind the colony being. And they usually bumblebees are pretty chill with you being around their boxes. That said, they seem to have personalities, and so we have one colony in the lab right now that is a little bit more spicy than the others, I would say. And most you can kind of pick up under red light, so simulating darkness. And they maybe like give a little hum or something. But we have one colony that you pick up and they just like start all buzzing around the box and freaking out. So you'll just have to learn your particular colony. Ellen asks about bumblebee natural predators. I feel like we already addressed that, but yeah, mostly mammals and then ectoparasites, so beetles and moths and things like that. I will say they also have lots of endoparasites, including canopid flies, which are pretty cool, a little bit more common in the eastern United States, which actually tackle bumblebee workers in flight and inject their larvae underneath the turga or the shields of their abdomen, basically, and then eat their way out of the bumblebee. Anonymous attendee asks, do bumblebees aim to sting your face when deserved, or are we just lucky? Unfortunately, you're just lucky. Joan asks, under what conditions are bumblebees aggressive? Again, they're pretty chill. I actually can't recall the last time I was stung by a bumblebee, despite that I handle them all the time. I think Nancy said she got stung last year. But basically, if you accidentally pin them and they're trapped, then they'll sting. But or if you're close to their nest and messing with it. But compared to some other bee species, quite a bit more passive. Have I heard about the possible speciation event occurring in Bombus silvicola in Colorado? Do I have any thoughts as to why this might be occurring? I'm guessing this might have to do something with that tongue length research, but without wanting to look at it and think about it more carefully, no, I can't say that I know about that particular publication right now, and I don't want to click on that and read that right now. But please send me that. I'd be happy to look at it and communicate with you via email. If you want to take a photo of a bumblebee, how long, considering safety issues, can you put the bumblebee in the fridge? You probably only need to put it on ice or in a refrigerator for like 5, 10, 15 minutes. Bigger bees will have to go in the freezer or in the fridge for longer because gas exchange. But when we collect queens to rear them in captivity, when I was doing that in California, sometimes we would get stuck in traffic and a 2-hour drive became like a 6-hour drive, and they did just fine. So I wouldn't recommend it, but you'll be fine if you're sticking them in a cooler for like 20, 30 minutes. But I'd aim for more like that 10, 15 minutes. What do I mean sunflowers are easy? Yeah, I mean that sunflowers are easy to grow. They're a lot weedier, these other things, and a little bit easier to establish, and that they're also easy to take photos of bees while they're foraging on. Michelle asks, what is Colorado's largest bumblebee? I have Bombus nevadensis, and they're huge. I was just wondering what our other large bees are. My guess would be nevadensis is the largest. I believe nevadensis is the largest bumblebee in North America, though Bombus paternus or the Southern Plains bumblebee will give it a run for its money as well. Yeah, quite large. Do bumblebees nest in artificial boxes? Asks Mark, and the answer is yes. So we put them in artificial boxes and they nest there. Though it has really low success rates, people put out artificial boxes and hope to get bumblebees. And then I got distracted by some of the next questions. But sometimes people find bumblebees in things like their siding. So we wrote up a note a couple of years ago on an endangered bumblebee species, the rusty patch bumblebee, who had been nesting in somebody's siding in downtown Minneapolis. Joan asks, how many times have you been stung by a bumblebee? What were you doing? Actually, my earliest memory of an interaction with the bumblebee is getting stung by one underneath a deck in Connecticut as a child. I honestly wasn't that into insects as a child, and I was just like getting a tennis ball or something from under a deck, and I got stung by a bumblebee. Now, in retrospect, I wonder if it was a rusty patch bumblebee, as they were much more common in my childhood than they are now. And haven't been seen in Connecticut in decades. Ellen asked, got any good bumblebee jokes? What kind of bee is no good at football? A fumblebee. No, I don't have any good ones, I guess. I might have some, and they're just not coming to me right now. Feel like we've discussed the how do you feel about putting out bumblebee houses, but about putting out like artificial bee homes more generally. I think they're great educational tools, and as long as you are willing to monitor them to determine if the species that are nesting in your blocks are native or not, and removing the non-native ones, so we're not just kind of like creating a ton of artificial habitat for non-native species, then I think they're really fun, and I have cavity nesting bee blocks at my house. Are bumblebees territorial? Any known distances between nests for species, i.e., would it be possible to find nests in some proximity? Yeah, so they don't seem to be territorial when resources are good. When resources begin to decline, they may become territorial, but it's not like they go into the other nest and kill the queen or something like that. Maybe that is how cuckoo bumblebees evolved slowly over time. But what we know from experiments where I've like put lots of little radio telemetry tags or RFID tags on bumblebees is that sometimes when resources got poor in the landscape, you detect an individual that we tagged in box A going into box B. But otherwise, they kind of stuck to their own boxes and they don't really attack each other. So long as there's enough to go around. And in the wild, I found lots of Bombus griseoculus or brown-belted bumblebee nests, like a couple dozen, all in one ditch outside of Madison, Wisconsin. Jocelyn asks, what diseases affect bumblebees? How do they affect them? There's all sorts of different endosymbionts or endoparasites. There are also endosymbionts, but all sorts of diseases that affect bumblebees. And they have a variety of effects. So Israeli acute paralysis virus, which also affects honeybees, affects bumblebees, and basically just results in like shock and sudden death of individuals. Crithidia bombi basically causes like languid and slow behavior. Veromorpha bombi or Nosema bombi, which is another fungal parasite, results in basically toxic diarrhea for bumblebees. So lots of different diseases that affect either brood or adults. Yeah, tons of diseases. Joe provides us with potential bumblebee speeds. Eric says, mail it to me. I don't know what you want me to mail, so I'll have to assume it's a bumblebee larva. Susan says, honeybees push away native bees from food sources, as I've seen in my garden. Would size of bumblebees give honeybees a second thought or not? That's an interesting question. I definitely see honeybees just bully whatever. Maybe because they have large colonies, they're quite more brazen or something. But I'm sure it would give them a second thought. They don't always seem to bully them, but yeah, I don't know of anything particularly testing, how bullied small bees are compared to large bees. Gene asks, what are non-native bumblebee species? Yeah, so for example, Bombus terrestris, which is the buff-tailed bumblebee and is widespread used for commercial pollination in Europe, and now is native to Europe and is now distributed around the world. The buff-tailed bumblebee was introduced into South America for pollination. I want to say in the 90s, though it could have been earlier than that. But the species is now invaded and become widespread throughout the country. This same thing has throughout the continent. And this same thing has happened in Japan as well. And as that species becomes widespread, it displaces native bumblebees. So Bombus dalbomii, which is the largest bumblebee species in the world, and quite an interesting and beautiful species, has unfortunately declined substantially as terrestris has become widespread. And similar patterns are happening in Japan. There are also Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, which is also commercialized, seems to have escaped from greenhouse pollination operations in the Pacific Northwest and in British Columbia, and has become naturalized there. It hasn't quite yet begun to displace native bumblebees, but maybe that unfortunately might be the future. Robert asked, what is the evolutionary morphology of flowers that resulted in attracting bumblebees for pollination? Example, shape of flower. Well, bumblebees are attracted to lots of different types of flowers, both ones that are radially symmetric and therefore a little bit more generalized, as well as bilaterally symmetrical flowers, which are a little bit more specialized. So I'm not sure that I could say that it drove one particular floral shape. I will say that bumblebees are quite reliable pollinators, and so they exhibit really high floral fidelity. And let me see if I deleted that entirely or not. I think you can see this, even though it's technically hidden. This is a study showing that basically bumblebees, when you observe individual foragers as they go out as naive individuals, if you observe each of their foraging trips over their life, they begin by basically visiting lots of different flowers on their foraging trips. So on average, in this study by Bernd Heinrich, they visited 5. And then over time, once that individual is on her 7th, 8th, 9th, so on foraging trip, she really has found the one floral species that she's going to focus on. And from the plant's perspective, that's great, because that means that this visitor isn't going to take my pollen and then bring it to some other species. Instead, she's going to reliably only forage on that one plant species. And we refer to this as majoring. So they focus on one plant species as they become experienced foragers. But bumblebees also exhibit a little bit of flexibility, and you'll notice that it's kind of common later on for them to check out some other plant species, because eventually that flower that they're majoring on is going to decline in availability. And so they should also minor on some other plant species. So as plant species 1 declines, plant species 2 becomes more common, and they switch over to foraging on that. And I really recommend Bernd Heinrich's books. Bumblebee Economics was written in the 70s and still holds up as a really fascinating book today. You're welcome for the joke, Ellen. I hope to think of a better bumblebee joke later, but I can't right now. Sounds good, Eric. And this, I think, is a great question to end on if it's the last question. Anonymous attendee says, some people say you can pet a bumblebee in the wild. Do you agree it is worth a try? Of course it is worth a try. They're quite fuzzy and nice. But if you're feeling a little suspicious of getting stung, maybe try petting a male bumblebee, which you can even hold in your hand and enjoy the soft hum of it in your fingers.
Okay, I think that was our last question. Thank you so much, John. This was such a wealth of information, and I could feel the enthusiasm. Like, that was a solid half hour of questions. So we really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge with us tonight.
Yeah, no problem. And again, if you go to molalab.org/resources, if you were hoping for a little bit more specifics on kind of front range identification, there's lots of slides in that slide deck that can help you walk through it. And I think it'll be a nice entry point that you can then add bumblebees of Colorado or bumblebees of North America to afterwards.
All right, sounds good. We had one more quick question. How do you identify a male bumblebee?
Oh, yeah. Well, the easiest way is to pick it up. And if it stings you, it's a female. And if it doesn't, it's a male. But short of that harrowing effort, you see, there are some key characteristics of males versus females. So females often have a pointy abdomen. So, especially if the stinger is actually exerted. And males have these kind of elongated or rounded abdomens. Really key is that males do not carry pollen on their hind legs or anywhere. This, just because you don't see pollen on the individual doesn't mean it's a male, but if you do see pollen packed on the corbicula like this, then this is assuredly a female. Some of the other characteristics are long antenna, and you can see this kind of elongated and round abdomen versus this pointy, stingy back end on the female. Females also have this flattened area on their hind legs, whereas males don't have that, and that's where she'll hold her pollen. So really, it's kind of a bunch of characters. So usually I'll rely on multiple traits. Often they have those kind of mustache-looking things. But if you spend a lot of time looking and working with them, hopefully you'll be able to figure it out over time. But multiple traits, and there's some slides in that slide deck that'll help walk you through it.
Okay, well, thanks again, John. This was fantastic. We'll get the recording out to everyone, and thank you all so much for attending tonight. What a great webinar.
Yeah, thanks y'all, and feel free to email me any questions or whatever, and I'll do my best to respond.
All right, everyone, have a good night. Thanks, take care.